The playas and battles of the Civil War. So in this video, I am going to go over the major generals for the Union and for the Confederates, which include Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Jefferson Davis. And then I will go over the major battles of the Civil War, including Fort Sumter, Antietam, Vicksburg, Gettysburg, and of course the battle for Atlanta. So let's begin. We'll start with the men who wore blue. See what I did there? Background, it's blue. When we get to the South, it'll be gray. So great, isn't it? So the first important Northern general was Ulysses S. Grant. So you may remember from class, we talked that Lincoln had had a number of issues with his generals. He was constantly upset with them, rotating them out. And Grant, toward the end of the war, is really kind of his right-hand man and the person that he feels he can rely on the most. So General Grant led the Northern Army in the West. That's where he got his start and made a name for himself. And he was trying to seize the Mississippi River, which we will get to later on. And after some of his great wins out west, he was selected by President Lincoln to command all of the Union troops. He had some early victories, including the capture of Fort Donelson and Fort Henry. And here, this earned him the nickname of Unconditional Surrender Grant because of the ferocity with which he went after Confederate troops and demanded their immediate surrender. He was generally in his career plagued by rumors of drinking. Historians debate over whether or not he was an alcoholic. He did have frequent migraine headaches, which a lot of people mistook for hangovers. So we're not really sure exactly what the extent of his drinking was. But as you can imagine, someone seeing the type of carnage that these soldiers were on a day-to-day basis, medicating themselves with alcohol was pretty common practice. He believed that by taking down the Confederate armies, that was going to be very important to the war effort. And so to that end, he sets out to track down and destroy Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and that is the main army of the Confederacy. And it is Grant who will eventually accept Robert E. Lee's surrender at the war in April 1865 at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Grant is very gallant in his acceptance of the surrender of Robert E. Lee. He allows Lee's men to keep their horses as well as their sidearms, their personal guns, and return to their homes, and he doesn't take any prisoners of war. And historians really applaud him for those efforts, not beating the South while they're down. Another important general that we'll hear about in the Battle for Atlanta is William Tecumseh Sherman. This guy takes no prisoners. He means business. He loves war. He loves death. He loves the smell of blood. A lot of people thought that he was insane. He was appointed to take Georgia and to split the Confederacy, which he does with ample speed and efficiency. He fought in the first Battle of Bull Run, where the Union was badly defeated. And this really affects him. He becomes extremely pessimistic about the outlook of the war for the Union. He constantly complains about lack of provisions, not enough horses, food, clothing. And so because of all of these complaints, he's eventually put on leave. And the media, the newspapers, essentially declare him to be insane. So he travels all around a little bit while he's on leave, and then eventually he gets reinstated into the army. He will fight with Grant at the Battle of Shiloh and Vicksburg, and they become really close friends, and Grant relies on Sherman quite a bit as his own right-hand man. And in September of 1864, William T. Sherman will take Atlanta, and he will burn it to the ground, which I'll talk about in more detail later on. And this begins his very celebrated march to the sea, where essentially he just kind of rips through Georgia and burns everything in his path. And he understood that in order to win the war and save the Union, he was going to have to use devastating tactics to basically break the Southern will to fight. So we had talked about that Southern pride previously, which was really strong, and it was kind of Sherman's mission in life to break that. Okay, so these men, they wore gray. So the really important Southern general is Robert E. Lee. He is the commander of the Virginia troops. He is the main military general for the Confederacy. And he is from Virginia. He trained at West Point. He fought in the Mexican-American War. He's the one that went in and put down John Brown's raid and finally captured him. Lincoln actually asked him to command the Union troops because Lee was such a celebrated general. But once Virginia seceded, Lee's loyalty was more to his state than to his country. And so he lamented that he had to follow his heart and his home, which was Virginia, and defend it. So he had to turn down President Lincoln's offer. So he becomes commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. He's a really smart soldier. He's very well liked and respected by the troops. They adore him. He gives the Confederacy a very crucial victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas as it's known. He unfortunately is plagued by disaster throughout. The South really is hampered at the beginning. They have a lot of things against them. We'll get more into that in class, but really the cards are stacked against them. So he tries to cross the Potomac, barely escaping at the bloody battle known as Antietam, which I'll discuss in depth in a minute. And it nearly kills over 14,000 of his men. He is also known for the Battle of Gettysburg. This is where the Union and the Confederacy would meet in a very bloody 3-day battle with mass casualties. Another important Southern general was Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He also went to West Point. He was a professor at the Virginia Military Institute when war broke out. He was also very well liked by his troops, and he was an extremely religious man who didn't even believe in fighting on Sundays. He made a name for himself in the First Battle of Bull Run. This was kind of one of the opening battles of the Civil War. The Union lost badly, and this is where Thomas Jackson would earn his nickname, Stonewall. He led his army ahead to a bridge, and there was a gap in the defensive line, and he attacked the Union. And General Bernard E. Bee of the Union was so impressed with General Jackson's attack that he exclaimed, "There's Jackson, standing like a stone wall," as his troops stood there not moving even against the Union assault. He defends Western Virginia against the Union Army's invasion. He leads the Confederate Army to a number of victories, and he joins General Lee's army in 1862, and he becomes Lee's right-hand man. Robert E. Lee looks at him as a son and relies on him to conduct several different battles. So joining Lee in the Peninsula Campaign, Jackson continues to fight in defense of Virginia. He achieves quite a bit of success at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, where he strikes Union General John Hooker's army from the rear and causes quite a bit of casualties. But unfortunately, on May 2nd, 1863, Jackson is accidentally shot by friendly fire. So he is shot by his own soldiers accidentally. And as a result of his injuries, he develops pneumonia and he ends up dying. And this was a devastating loss to Robert E. Lee. And then we have the President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. So he's named president February 18th, 1861. So he takes office before Abraham Lincoln even takes office over the United States. He is in way over his head. He's usually plagued with talks of impeachment. He suffered from nervous disorders. He had some tics. He's captured by Union forces in Georgia on May 10th, 1865, and he is charged with treason. And he is imprisoned at Fort Monroe in Virginia until he is released, and he was released on bail, which was paid by the abolitionist newspaper editor Horace Greeley. So to the battles, right? We have Fort Sumter, South Carolina. These are the opening shots of the Civil War. So after Lincoln is inaugurated, some of the southern states secede, including South Carolina. And the United States has some federal forts in these states that seceded, and Fort Sumter is one of those. So Fort Sumter is commanded by Major Robert Anderson. He's a Kentuckian who has a Georgia wife, and he has enough supplies in the fort for only a month. And the fort is being surrounded by a Confederate ring of fire. And so on April 4th, 1861, Lincoln decides to resupply Major Anderson's troops holed up at Fort Sumter. And so Lincoln tells the governor of South Carolina that he's only sending food, not guns. Okay? But unfortunately, South Carolina is just looking for a fight. And so they order General P.T. Beauregard, who had actually been Anderson's teacher at West Point, to demand that his former students surrender. Anderson refuses, and so just before dawn on April 12th, 1861, the Confederates begin sending cannons, shelling the fort. And so after 33 hours, Anderson has exhausted all of his ammunition, and so he has no choice at this point but to surrender. And after the surrender of Fort Sumter, many other southern states, as you can see there, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina all decide to join the South in secession. Okay, the next major battle is in Antietam, Maryland. So Lee is determined, Robert E. Lee, is determined to move the battlefield out of the South and perhaps gain foreign recognition for the Confederacy, meaning he wants to get France and Britain to formally recognize the Confederacy as a country and possibly lend aid. So in September 1862, he leads his troops into western Maryland and heads for Pennsylvania. And as luck would have it, Lee's bold strategy is uncovered when a Union soldier picks up a bundle of cigars and discovered a secret order from Lee wrapped around them. The paper revealed that Lee had again divided his army, sending Stonewall Jackson off to take Harper's Ferry in Virginia. So General McClellan, who is the head of the Union forces at this time, is quite excited. He says, "Here's a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be going to go home." So instead of leaping at this unexpected opportunity and delivering a decisive blow to the Confederates, McClellan delays for 16 hours, still worried, as usual, about enemy strength. And during this delay, Robert E. Lee is able to reassemble most of his army behind Antietam Creek. So on September 17, 1862, McClellan's forces attack, and the furious Battle of Antietam really begins at this point. The Confederates are outnumbered more than 2-1, and they forced a standoff in the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. It was a day that most of the participants thought would never end. In late afternoon, McClellan backs off. He lets Robert E. Lee slip away across the Potomac, and Lincoln is so disgusted by McClellan's failure to follow up and gain a truly decisive victory that he sends the following message to the general. Lincoln says, "I have just read your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done that fatigues anything?" And later, even more upset when he doesn't hear back from McClellan, President Lincoln sends another letter to McClellan. It's just one sentence, and it says, "If you don't want to use the army, I should like to borrow it for a while." So Antietam becomes one of the most decisive battles of the Civil War. The Confederates will never again be so close to victory. The French and the Brits were about to come to the aid of the South, and now they don't after the Confederates had been badly defeated. And Lincoln uses this Union victory to release the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, we now move on to Vicksburg, Mississippi. So Grant knew that if he could capture Vicksburg, the Union forces could gain control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in two. Remember, this had been Lincoln's plan from all along. Vicksburg had withstood repeated naval attacks, and for months Grant tried to discover a new way to penetrate the city's heavily fortified defenses. The terrain of the area really complicated this effort. Vicksburg was surrounded by bayous and marshes that made travel and resupply almost impossible. There were torrential rains, widespread disease, and this really hampered Grant's army's movements. But Grant decided to leave his supply base and just live off the land. He's taking a risk here. His army crossed to Louisiana, took a roundabout route to Jackson, Mississippi, where it routed the Confederates, absolutely destroyed them. And then he heads back to Vicksburg. And here, the Federals pinned down 30,000 Confederates in Vicksburg, cutting off their access to the Mississippi River. And so Grant's plan was essentially to just starve them out at this point. So the reopening of the Mississippi River to the Union helps to quell the peace agitation of the Ohio River Valley states. They had been really upset that the Mississippi River had been taken because this had disrupted their trade routes. But now that the North once again had control of the Mississippi, those states in the Ohio River Valley stopped yelling to make peace and end the war. And Britain and France back out on deals for ships that they were going to sell to the Confederacy to aid in their war effort. So then we march on to Gettysburg. So the plight of besieged Vicksburg put the Confederacy command in a quandary. So Lee proposes a diversion. He believes if he can win a great victory on Northern soil, he might do more than just to relieve the pressure on Vicksburg. He might bring an end to the war. So in June 1863, he moves his forces into the Shenandoah Valley and heads north across Maryland. Hooker, who is in charge of the Union troops at this time, follows Lee, keeping his forces between Lee and Washington, D.C., so that Lee can't capture the capital city. But Hooker is just coming off a demoralizing defeat in Chancellorsville, and so he ends up resigning, and Lincoln replaces him with Major General George Meade. Neither the Union nor the Confederacy chose Gettysburg, Pennsylvania as the site for this really huge battle that's coming up. But the Confederates had sent a foraging party into the town to look for shoes, and they encountered a bunch of Union cavalry. Cavalry are forces on horses. And so the main forces of the Union and the Confederacy quickly converge on Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And so on July 1st, the Confederates push Union forces out of the town, but unfortunately they push them onto the high ground, which is an advantage for the Union. On day 2, Lee orders an assault on the left and right flanks of the Union Army, and despite the Confederates' great effort, the Union forces outnumbered the Confederates almost 2-to-1, and they're able to push off the attack. And then in a last desperate measure on day 3, Lee stakes everything on one final attack at Cemetery Ridge. His plan suffers from a fatal problem, however. His generals were not unified in their support of it. Some deemed it a suicide mission. And so at about 2 p.m. that day, Confederate General George E. Pickett leads his 15,000 troops from the woods across the open field of Cemetery Ridge, and they run right into Union fire. Pickett's troops were supposed to be supported by General Longstreet, but he was one of the generals that disagreed with this particular maneuver, and so Longstreet did not order his troops to support Pickett. And so Pickett's troops, as I said, walk right into Union fire, and less than half of them survive. It's a really devastating loss for Robert E. Lee. He becomes quite depressed and melancholy after this, and he mutters, "This has all been my fault." There's nothing left for Lee to do here. He takes his dejected and mangled army south. They retreat in a driving rain that washes the blood from the grass. And to make matters even worse, on that same day, the entire Confederate garrison at Vicksburg surrenders. And so now the Confederacy is completely split. And had Meade aggressively pursued Lee out of Gettysburg, he might have delivered the final blow to the rebels. But he allows Lee to retreat, which angers Lincoln quite a bit. And then finally, while Grant is chasing Lee in Virginia, the battle-hardened William Tecumseh Sherman is doggedly pursuing Joe Johnston's Confederate army through North Georgia toward Atlanta. Sherman loved a toe-to-toe fight. Johnston preferred retreat and evasion, determined not to risk a single life until the perfect conditions for fighting were obtained. So this made President Jefferson Davis very impatient, and he finally exploded, and he replaced Johnston with Texan John B. Hood. And John Hood was called All Lion, None of the Fox. He had an arm crippled by a ball at Gettysburg, and most of his leg was shot off at Chickamauga. And Hood was so badly disabled he had to be strapped to his horse, but he remained one of the most tenacious fighters in the war. And during late July 1864, Hood's army struck 3 times at Sherman's army from Atlanta, but each time he was defeated in very bloody battle. And Sherman was finally able to encircle Atlanta, cut off the rail lines, and force Hood to evacuate on September 1st. And Sherman sends a pretty nasty letter to the mayor of Atlanta, essentially demanding his unconditional surrender. Sherman writes, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. And those who brought war into our country deserve all the curses and maledictions a people can pour out." So Sherman resolves to make all of Georgia howl as his army embarks on a very devastating march southeast through central Georgia. His intention was to whip the rebels, humble their pride, and follow them into their inmost recesses and make them fear and dread us. Hood takes his army and moves through Alabama and Tennessee, hoping to lure Sherman away from the deep South, but Sherman does not take the bait. During all of this, Sherman and his forces are marching through Georgia, pioneering the modern practice of total war against the enemy's resources and will to resist. Sherman says war is war, not a popularity contest. And on November 15th, 1864, his men burn most of Atlanta. And then they march from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying any crops or livestock or supplies that might serve the Confederate forces. And so after a month, Sherman approaches Savannah. They had cut a swath of desolation 250 miles long. He was going to keep the pressure on until they were not only ruined, exhausted, but humbled in pride and spirit. And on December 21st, Sherman rides into Savannah, and 3 days later he offers the city as a Christmas gift to Lincoln. But he doesn't stay there long. He just resupplies his forces, and then he moves across the river to that hellhole of secession, South Carolina, where he torches more than a dozen towns.